Now, you can fund pre-development as part of the fund, but you really have to have a good handle on how long that process takes, and I think it's a pretty risky move in this program. That's also the picture right now. I think, and there's a lot, and this is another place Treasury has been asked to weigh in and to provide some relief for funds and investors, that Treasury will provide some kind of ramp-up period for funds, for first-time funds, to be able to hold on to cash, essentially, to offset some of this tension that's going to exist with investors. But I'm not sure they're going to do that. They haven't been very clear publicly, and it may not be a lot of time, and maybe you have a year, for example, before the clock ticks on funds being tested by the IRS, which happens every 6 months. The core kind of compliance regime in this program is that every 6 months, IRS is going to test opportunity zone funds to make sure they have 90% of their capital deployed in qualified assets, whether it's real estate or business or partnerships or whatever. And if that clock doesn't start till a year down the road or 18 months down the road, that will enable you to hold cash and basically stretch things out for a much longer period of time. There's some tactics that let you stretch it out now, potentially in putting them in a sub, not in the fund, but dropping it into a new co like we talked about. That has a larger clock to invest. They've got 31 months to invest in projects. So I think there are ways to expand that clock, but a big ground-up development that maybe takes 5 years to develop will be tricky. I think you'll have to make sure you've got enough investment and enough deals to be able to do multiple funds, because I don't like investment periods for funds in this program longer than a couple of years. So you can do vintages of funds and have other assets simultaneously that can also take in capital. Otherwise, I think it'll be very frustrating for investors, except the biggest investors that constantly have capital gains. That's a nice problem to have, but it's hard to find those investors.
Next question.
There's not really a new marketplace, although I talked to lots of startup marketplaces in this space that are trying to scratch that itch. I've not seen one that I'm blown away by yet, but it's early days. I think that's a hard part of this program. You've got to, traditionally real estate, particularly big projects, are funded by tax-exempt sources like pension funds and endowments that I do not expect to be big investors in this marketplace. But I see it happening all the time. It usually starts with high net worth investors that are within the kind of immediate ecosystem. Wealth managers of all types are going to, I think, be big players in this space, and they're having conversations with hundreds of funds and hundreds of projects. And then I think corporate investors will be much bigger investors than they are now. Think like insurance companies. They've got lots of capital gains and can invest in alternative asset classes. Think foreign investors that are taxed in the U.S. So there's going to be, I think, more and more sources of capital as there are more and more regulatory clarity. But it's hard. I don't think funds have had nearly as much success raising capital as they thought they would. But I think that's for two reasons, honestly. One is because of the regs. I think any wealth manager, advisor, accountant says, wait a minute, let's wait to get more of those regs before you pick a fund. This is not a good tax incentive program if that fund loses all your money, so let's make sure they know what they're doing and make sure they know what they're doing on the tax strategy as well. And two, there's a lot of new funds in this space. Almost every fund's a new vehicle. I think lots of them have fund managers that have a track record in real estate or private equity or something in this space, or infrastructure investing or impact investing, but some of them don't. And I think it's a little bit of a crowded market. Everyone's trying to sort it out. I think this is a temporary phenomenon, and the reason I feel that way is when I talk to the wealth managers, they are really desperate to get products because their clients are telling them they're going to leave and go somewhere else because they want to find this product. Keep in mind, this is the only part of the tax code that lets you go from the equities market to the real estate market and have this type of tax advantage. It's also the only part of the tax code that lets you get a full capital gains step up without having to die. So that's usually a benefit for investors, the not dying part. And so it's really unique. And so investors want to use it. They're just not comfortable enough with the rules and the funds, but that will change. Again, I think the second half of this year, you'll see a lot of that change. It's still hard though. And I work with funds that work with cap placement agents, that work with banks to help them fundraise. So there's a mix of folks out there. I don't think anyone's cracked the code yet though.
I think these summits are the place where we're finding a lot of them. Obviously, that's what my firm does, Access Capital. My partner, Tim, who was on the last panel. There's at least 3 other funds that have been here throughout the day. So we can help connect you. But I'm finding there's a lot of the broker-dealer network is sniffing around opportunity zones, but there's only a very few that actually get it and are actually doing opportunity zone deals, because it's a different animal, because it has to be documented differently, the legal regulations, it's a whole different animal in that regard. So they're around. They're definitely around.
And there's
Go ahead.
And there's some online resources as well, much like new markets tax credits, where there's databases that show the fund and where they're operating. If you Google it as well, there's opportunity zone fund databases as well that also show that as well.
I was just going to make a... Yeah. I think that's a good point. I just want to make one general kind of flag for folks raising outside capital, and I come across this all the time. I'm surprised by it. So we've talked about IRS, because IRS is the reporting regime that's relevant to opportunity zones. If you're raising a meaningful amount of capital from third-party folks, you still have to comply with the SEC, regardless of if you're doing private equity funds, regardless if they're doing real estate or others. So, if you're in the ballpark of 150 million or so in equity from outside investors, you should also be thinking SEC compliance. That's the reason I kind of lay that out there, is because messing up with your SEC compliance is a way different ballgame than on your IRS compliance. The good news is it's pretty commoditized. There's all sorts of firms, both law firms and other firms, that do this for a living and can help you figure out how to make sure you're SEC compliant. But I make sure I was thinking about that if I'm raising a meaningful amount of money into these funds, that's another compliance regime to be aware of and to be careful about.
Give a 5-minute warning.
The American Society of Civil Engineers just across the country gives us a D- on our structural stuff. And you've been talking about, seems like smaller opportunity zones, but for like public, private, light rail, roads, infrastructure, subways, toll roads, is there any opportunity zone funds going that way?
So I think that's a harder asset class for this model for a couple reasons, but it's not impossible. And I work with one fund that does largely infrastructure deals, including rural broadband and other stuff like that. One is, these zones are individual zones, at least, are census tracts. Those are pretty small geographies, bigger in rural areas, smaller in urban areas. In lots of the country, you've got a number of contiguous tracts. But if you're doing something like light rail, your assets have to be in the zone. That strikes me as a pretty hard model. The other one is more of an economic question. This is a program built around appreciating assets. Typically, infrastructure is a depreciating asset. Renewable energy is doable because of how it depreciates and the other tax incentives. So I think it's much more complicated, but I'm sure there'll be some of it. The one big exception to all of this is in Puerto Rico, which I think will use this heavily around infrastructure and energy, because it's one huge contiguous track in Puerto Rico, and because energy is very expensive there, and and other reasons where they've got tons of incentives. But in general, I think infrastructure is a harder class than either business investment or real estate.
So we are out of time, and I just want to give a shout out right now to our sponsors. They made this whole thing possible. We had, if you look in that program, please take a look at the sponsors that sponsored, especially Reno Land and Blockchains. They were our diamond sponsors, and they are the reason that Steve is sitting here with us today and was able to speak with all of you. So thank you very much to our sponsors. Okay, so, yeah, please.
I'm sure you're going to get plenty of this, but
Yeah.
but Kea was, in a month, he took what I'm sure she thought at the time was maybe a crazy idea and turned it into one of the biggest opportunity zone events in the country. And at least from my perspective, she was really the mover behind making this all happen. So I'm really grateful to be included, but I'm sure everyone here is grateful for you too.
Thank you. Okay, so now we have a little bit of a break, and then the next session is a really big deal. This is when we talk about housing, and this is the biggest issue we have here. So if you have any stake in housing, low-income housing tax credits, new market tax credits, stacking incentives, that's the next panel. You're not going to want to miss it. Thank you, Steve. Yes. Yes. Oh, let me shut that up.